Before I begin, let me just direct you to the index cards that you have in front of you. Anytime over the course of my presentation, I'd like you to answer a few questions for me. One is something you learned. Two, what is something you have a question about? There'll be many opportunities to ask questions, but they're more focused on clarity or practice. Maybe you have a different type of question or a question we just didn't have time for. And next, something you would like to learn more about. That will be helpful for me as we hopefully continue conversations about this at the center. So I'd appreciate it if you keep that in mind. But with that having been said, I want to dive right in because we have very little time together. And I would like to begin by providing a little context for the information I'm about to share. As Nika said, this information was gathered from a wide variety of literature on multiracial congregations that I compiled in a master's thesis at Boston University this past year. I was a research fellow during that time, and Nika and Rudy especially was quite helpful in offering the support and guidance so my thesis could be the best that it could be. And what I want to share with you today is really the heart of my thesis, looking at the unintended counterproductive consequences of multiracial congregations. And some of you might think, my goodness, unintended counterproductive consequences, that sounds so negative. You know, why are we focusing on the problems? Megan, how do you really feel about multiracial congregations anyway? And that is why I would like to identify a few of my assumptions that will serve as a framework for you to understand what I'm about to say. And my first assumption is there is strong theological support for multiracial congregations. Now, this point, along with many other that you'll hear this afternoon, I won't be able to go into detail or really support at this time, but if you have any questions or would like me to refer you to further resources, I would be happy to do that. Next, my assumption is that multiracial congregations can contribute to racial reconciliation. Michael Emerson, in a nationwide study, actually showed that people who participate in multiracial congregations increase cross-racial relationships on all levels of intimacy, have transformed social and political perspectives as it relates to matters of race. They develop a preference for genuine integration instead of assimilation. And they also develop a bridging social capital that helps to develop relationships between and within different groups. So with this in mind, I am an advocate of multiracial congregations, but I do not think that monoracial congregations are unbiblical or an obstacle to Christian unity. So with this in mind, let's define multiracial congregations. A multiracial congregation is a congregation in which no one racial group makes up more than 80% of the congregation. So there's people necessarily of different races, there's a potential for cross-racial interaction, but what is most important to recognize about this definition is it is strictly quantitative, not qualitative. As a result, identifying a congregation as multiracial does not speak to whether or not people are well integrated and there's equal power dynamics, or whether the numerical minority are just tokens in the pews. And this is a little more of what my research explores. So I want to give you an overview of the two problems I'm going to address. How, despite explicit intentions in multiracial congregations to develop an egalitarian community, we find two things. The first is white hegemony. I like to call this the problem of absence. It's a problem because there's something missing that should be there. And in the context of my research, I'm defining it as suppression of non-white cultures and influence due to white dominance and control. The next problem is black essentialism. I like to call this the problem of presence because there is the presence of something that should not be there. And again, for the purpose of my research, I'm defining it as the presence of inaccurate portrayals of the black worship tradition and utilitarian relationships. Let's take the time to explore this some more. First, white hegemony. This information I'm drawing largely from a study done by Corey Edwards that is written about in her book, The Elusive Dream. This, other resources that I'll be referring to, as well as suggested resources, you'll be able to see at the end of this PowerPoint, which I'd also be happy to send out to people. And Edwards found that in multiracial churches, where the two primary groups are black and white, blacks yield to the preferences of whites. So as you may know, black churches and white churches and the traditions behind them often have different practices, expressions, and beliefs. And one might think that when people from these different traditions come together in a multiracial congregation, those practices, traditions, and beliefs would fall somewhere in between these two different traditions. But Edwards argues that in certain circumstances, instead of finding a healthy medium, multiracial congregations actually conform to the practices of whites. She found that this is true after controlling for factors like age, religious tradition, and whether or not a congregation is charismatic. And she also found that this may be the case despite the presence of a number of qualities that are known to contribute to a successful and well-integrated multiracial congregation, such as multiracial leadership and a vision for diversity and equality. She even found that this is true in a predominantly black church with a black senior pastor, which was actually a case study that she explored to a greater extent. So despite what people might think, even in seemingly ideal circumstances, this can still be a problem. And furthermore, Edwards hypothesized that these findings can be generalized to multiracial congregations of various racial compositions. So in this study and other studies throughout, because a lot of them focus on blacks and whites, you'll hear me identify those two racial groups, but I want you to hear it as being inclusive of and potentially reflecting the experience of other racial groups as well. So let's look at where we see white hegemony in multiracial congregations. It shows up primarily in worship and in civil engagement. And Edwards found that though, again, black churches have a certain preference and way of doing things, in multiracial congregations, they're conforming to the ways to the practices and preferences of whites. This is seen in expression of worship. For example, black churches are 8.6 times more likely to participate in hand raising and 4.7 times more likely to participate in verbal affirmation, such as saying hallelujah or amen, talking back to the pastor, than their white counterpart. Despite this, multiracial congregations conforming to the practices of whites. Similarly, black congregations are 7 times more likely to have a choir and far less likely to have times of greeting during the service than white churches, than multiracial churches, or than white churches, forgive me. But again, they still conform to the preferences of whites. So what is the significance of this? You know, people do things differently. People can do different things in different contexts, sure. But worship has been found to be deeply connected to an individual's identity and self-expression. And Edwards summarizes this well. She says congregations engage in the most dramatic rituals, their most intentional presentations of their self-identity. Worship services are the most central in the sense that people are proclaiming who they are, not only to themselves, but also to others. They tell us who belong and who does not. They tell us what is allowed, what is praiseworthy, and what is unacceptable. So because of this connection, it can be argued that when people aren't allowed to worship and express themselves the way that they feel most comfortable with, it's actually a suppression of their identity. The other area where this is seen is in civil engagement. Black churches, for example, are more likely to be involved politically in things like voter registration, the facilitation of political discussion, and hosting of candidates. However, in multiracial congregations, we again see conformity to the practices of whites. Also, interracial churches are 2.6 times less likely than black churches, and to have conversations on race, and 7 times less likely than interracial churches to celebrate their cultural heritage. And the significance of this is that ever since the inception of the black church in America, I believe, they've been instrumental in advocating for the needs and celebrating and preserving the culture of the black community. They do that sometimes in a way that doesn't happen in secular society. So if black people are not participating in those communities that are advocating for their beliefs and preserving their culture, Edwards actually says that it is a detriment to their ability to do so if they're attending multiracial congregations as multiracial congregations currently exist. Let me pause for a second before I go on to black essentialism. Was that clear? Do you guys have any questions? Yes.
So, if I could go back to, can you go back several slides?
Okay. Is this like an essential to understand the next part question?
I'm sorry?
Is this like essential to understand the next part question?
No, but it is a clarifying question.
Okay. Let's hold general clarifying questions. If there's any way I'm pretty confused, in order to understand the next half, we need to pause for a second. Let me take those questions now. Yes?
Give me a synonym for hegemony.
Control.
Control.
Yes.
Why didn't you use control?
Good question. Thanks for pointing that out. All right, let me look at Nick's problem, black essentialism. So there are a number of underlying assumptions and dynamics that contribute to black essentialism in multiracial congregations. This is drawn from the book Worship Across the Racial Divide by Gerardo Martí. And the following assumptions exist in multiracial congregations. First, that worship is connected to diversity in multiracial congregations. This is actually true, but as the presentation will go on to reveal, different than the way most people think it is true. Next, the assumption is that blacks are more spiritual. And first you might think, well, that doesn't sound too bad. That actually sounds like it could be complementary. But as one digs deeper into this assumption, they may realize that it's drawing a connection between race and spirituality, between race and divine favor. And it was actually this connection, though framed negatively in another sense, that white people held coming to America, saying that they were God's chosen people, that their race was superior, and that they could draw upon the slave trade in order to continue God's work in a new country. So we need to be careful about where our assumptions will lead us. And also, the final assumption is that blacks are gifted with a special grace for genuine worship because of their oppression. And interestingly, this is held by both blacks and non-blacks alike. So, working alongside these assumptions are a number of underlying dynamics that can be found in multiracial congregations. First, there's pressure on worship leaders to maintain diversity with little training on how to do so. Added to that is that of all the races, it is most difficult to maintain the presence of blacks in multiracial congregations. And third, worship leaders think, and studies do confirm, that black people are initially attracted to churches by gospel music. So you have worship leaders thinking they need to help make things more diverse. They know that it's hard to maintain black people, but if we play more gospel music, more black people will come, and then it will seem more diverse. So these assumptions and these dynamics together lead to this result in practice, is that black worship leaders can be seen as the key to diversity. As a result, worship leaders with the best of intentions, they look for black worship leaders to diversify worship and thus the congregation. But because they want to attract blacks, because they want to make it feel diverse and more black, they draw upon stereotypes in order to do this. And Marty found that when this is being done, there's often a double standard. in that blacks are encouraged to act black when they're leading worship, but then they're encouraged to suppress that when they are worshiping among the congregation. So really, this pressure to provide results contributes to black worship leaders and the richness of the black worship tradition being glossed over and engaged as a means to an end. Thank you. The irony is that this is not necessary. Marty actually researched a number of successfully integrated, more egalitarian, multiracial communities and found that there were 4 worship styles that they used and he believed contributed to their success. Only one of which was drawing upon worship traditions that are associated with certain races, and none of which were capitalizing on essentialism and stereotypes. So let's take a minute to summarize these problems. The issue of white hegemony is that despite good intentions and the ability to foster reconciliation in some ways, multiracial churches can suppress black worship tradition and maintain the status quo. As a result, multiracial congregations may not be a space for blacks to express themselves, preserve their culture, and/or work towards change. When we look at black essentialism, we see that it makes assumptions about who and what a black person is. There's the amplification of stereotypes, and there's double standards, the glossing over of rich traditions, and the utilization of blacks as a means to an end.
So Megan, similarly, can you just give a synonym for essentialism?
Yeah, essentialism is to say that in order to be a black person, you are this, or this makes up a black person, or a white person, or an Asian person.
So somebody telling a person, these are the essential qualities of blackness or Asianness.
Yes. Thank you, Nika.
So like an applied stereotype?
Yeah, it's like saying, well, if you are black, you are necessarily more spiritual, or all black people do this, and if you're not this, then somehow you're not black.
And it can be done with any group, women, white men.
Yes, thank you. So these are humbling problems. They can be overwhelming problems. But I believe that one of the first steps in making progress is identifying these problems. So let's take a look at implications for practice. First, having diverse people in the room does not mean that they're being treated equally. 2, giving people opportunities to share their culture does not promote equality within itself. 3, developing a racially diverse and egalitarian community requires an awareness of power dynamics, self, and others that are not inherent in multiracial congregations. And finally, God's grace is needed to foster unity in the body of Christ. So these are difficult implications. It may show us that we have a lot of work to do. But I believe that there is hope. Despite the tone of this presentation, I actually am very encouraged by multiracial congregations and how they can contribute to reconciliation. And I believe that there is hope in that it's God's will for there to be unity in the church. And such unity is made possible by the work that Jesus already did on the cross. I believe that there is hope because even when we act in counterproductive ways, there's grace for and redemption found in our shortcomings. I believe there is hope because there are resources available that can help churches move towards becoming racially egalitarian congregations. And I believe there is hope because case studies and personal testimonies affirm that it's possible to have life-giving relationships in multiracial congregations that contribute to racial reconciliation. Thank you.
So for the clarification questions, Megan, can you slip up to the slide on your summary slide?
Yeah.
Just to help people remember what clarification questions they have.
Sure.
And I'll start out. You mentioned in the very beginning the difference between integration and assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
and the different movements. Can you just say what that means and elaborate on the relevance of that statement to me?
Sure. Integration is when you have people of diverse backgrounds. I mean, in this case, we're talking about race, but it can be any type of diversity. And to integrate means that people are not only coming together, but space is being made for them. They are allowed to be who they are, and we can learn and interact from one another. And in the context of my thesis, it means that the culture of the group or organization is actually being changed to accommodate and to allow those individuals to both be themselves and shape the culture of the community, whereas assimilation is more saying you have to conform to the way things already are. And you see both in multiracial congregations and multiracial organizations, but it's the first that reflects more egalitarian power dynamics and what I believe reflects God's desire for the church.
Thank you. Okay, so just a couple of logistics around how we do clarification questions. Megan has the mic, so can you repeat a clarification question?
Yes.
Someone says to you for the purpose of the video before you answer it. And, well, that's actually the only logistics. So,
Okay.
So, are there any clarification questions? They can be complex. They don't have to be basic, like what does this word mean? But it really should be focused on helping you understand the presentation.
So can you go back to your first slide on writing down?
Yes.
Okay, your last bullet point. When you talk about generalized multiracial congregations of various other racial compositions, were you talking about, so right before this you've been talking about black and white. So is this white and some other race? Or would this also hold true, does this mean like a black and Latino would also have this same?
Good question. Edwards was referring specifically to... Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Dana was asking, by other various racial compositions, do I mean white and another race, a non-white race that's not black? Or do I mean, could it happen between two different communities of color? And Edwards is referring to white and some other race other than black in particular. She really focuses on whiteness and the implications that it has in society. But I would hypothesize that it could be true among other cultures in different ways in America, and I think certainly outside of America, where racial dynamics are different between different ethnic groups that might function similar to the way whiteness functions in America, that would also be true.
Other clarifying questions, understanding?
I have a question about worship, and maybe if you can go to that slide. You said that churches often hire black worship leaders.
Yes.
But ironically, that's unnecessary, and then I missed why. Maybe I just missed that.
Yeah, that's something I didn't go into a lot of detail on, but is a whole book that you can read that talks about how Marty went to successfully integrated multiracial congregations, and he found that they had 4 different worship styles that he believed contributed to their more egalitarian environment, and only one of them drew upon sort of what would be seen as a traditional, black style of worship, or Asian style of worship or whatnot. And so there are other styles. There's like the traditionalists, there's the professionalists. I don't have all of them off the top of my head, but where you can do things that look completely different, then don't involve black worship leaders, and still have the same results. At the end of the day, his conclusion is that it's really not about having people on stage that contributes to multiracial congregations. It's about having people interacting, and being on a worship team, a multiracial worship team, contributes to the development of relationships that helps to shape the atmosphere of the congregation. So that's really the core of it, not who is on stage, but who is interacting with whom.
right talking about white hegemony and that even in a congregation you're holding for other variables, including leadership of color, that there's, like, people are acquiescing to the white norm? Besides worship, I'm curious if there's other things happening, like leadership style or decisions that are being made, norms around childcare, finances. Is it mostly what you've discovered have to do with worship, or are there other major things that are happening in churches that are affected by the same phenomenon?
Yeah, good question. Stacy had asked, when it comes to white hegemony, does it just impact worship, or another area I had mentioned was civil engagement, or does it impact other aspects of church life? And Edwards is the only one that has explored this to this extent. What Michael Emerson, Gerardo Marti, and others in that camp are exploring are really cutting edge. This is a field that is relatively new, and she drew upon national data sets in order to explore worship and a few other select areas within that and with church practice. Something she found in her study was not contributing, was sort of not involved with white hegemony, but there was a lot of other areas that she didn't have the opportunity to look at. So she's currently working on another study that will explore more about the leadership and how the way churches are led may contribute to the power dynamics in multiracial congregations. You're welcome. Yes?
I don't know if this is clarifying enough, but
go for it.
What's unique about churches is people are not paid to be there.
Mm-hmm.
They are there on their own free will.
Yes.
So it's a little different than looking at business or anything else. Is that people choose to come.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that connect in? Because you're right, church is very personal, and so your identity is there. If someone would feel that their identity is being lessened, wouldn't they just go somewhere else? You know what I mean? I mean, what?
So I'm gonna, so for the context of our, first of all, Neil's question is a good transition into talking about practice because Neil is a pastor.
Right.
And so this is his practice. But also, I also hear a clarifying question in it that I want to throw out to help us understand. Is it inherently, well, two things, so I'm a little bit putting words in those mouths. So one is it inherently bad that some things are being suppressed if people don't mind? So do the findings suggest that? And then the other question I'm hearing from us more directly is, if people actually felt they were being suppressed and it were inherently bad, wouldn't they just leave the congregation? So do those things relate to some of the findings that you've had?
Yes. Yes. Good questions. Thank you. So is it inherently bad that certain things are being suppressed? And I would say that when you have a multiracial congregation, everyone comes in from different cultures. I mean, even in regular congregations, different denominations, different expectations, different preferences. And being in a congregation together requires a certain measure of yielding to one another. So everyone who's in the room is going to be yielding to a certain extent. I also think that even in congregations where certain things are being suppressed, they can be very healthy congregations and life-giving congregations in a number of areas. However, I would say especially when it relates to areas of culture and race, that does touch upon things that are very personal and has implications on how people feel that they are seen and heard. It's deeply connected to identity. So I would say that, in the cases of Black essentialism and white hegemony, that those can have, potentially have quite negative consequences. So we need to be mindful of that, and just, in the yielding process, I mean, really what it comes down to is, are people yielding equally to one another, or is it one culture or race that is yielding far more to another than all the others? And that's especially where it becomes, that inequality of yielding is when it becomes problematic. And then the question is, if there are these dynamics, why don't people just go somewhere else? It's a voluntary organization, absolutely. And the answer to that is a lot of people do. The multiracial congregations are known as being incredibly unstable because people who are the numerical minority pay higher costs of being in a multiracial congregation, and a number of things that they might hope to get out of a church, they don't necessarily get out of a church because of inequitable power dynamics. And they know that if they go back to a church where people look like them and behave like them and have a shared culture, then they are not going to have to pay some of those costs. So a number of people do leave. With that having been said, the reason that multiracial congregations are able to stay multiracial is really, well, there's sort of two dynamics that contribute to this hegemony. Is white people have to be willing to leave. And as a general rule of thumb, white people they leave more freely because they have dominance and control in society at large. If they're not getting something that is tailored to their preferences, it's easier for them to go somewhere else where those preferences are met. So whites are more likely to leave if they don't get what they want. But the other dynamic is you need people of color, in the case of Edwards' study, blacks, to actually care that they leave. And some blacks in particular, if they grew up in a more multiracial environment, if they have an interracial family, then they may be actually more comfortable in those mixed communities. And so they may be more willing to yield to others. And that, if you have just 10% of the congregation that's willing to do that, or who perhaps enjoy, the cross-racial relationships, or developing the social capital, or any of those other benefits, then they would be likely to stay, even despite the problems.
Was your first point that whites would be willing to leave?
Yeah, whites have to be willing to leave. In order for one, well, for white hegemony to exist, and for multiracial, for white hegemony to exist.
I don't understand that point. So, how does whites being willing to leave contribute to white hegemony?
Because, well, that's part of it, but then the second part that is also necessary is that people of color have to want them to stay and want to maintain a multiracial congregation, which leads them to be willing to submit.
So maybe something like the fear of people leaving causes, in part, a shift towards creating an environment where white people would actually stay.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of what you said is really great, Megan. We often ask people, why do you come to this church? By far, they don't say the music, they don't say the preaching. Almost everybody to a T says, because of the diversity here, people love it. Almost 100%. But then, I love what you said there. Diversity in a congregation is not inherent. It doesn't, just because the outside looks like that, doesn't always make it true. And boy, that's absolutely true, because if you're in a diverse congregation, you got to be there on purpose. There's a reason you got to be, you're choosing to be there, because it's easier to be somewhere else. Because you have to always do that deal. You're always, and so to be part of a multiracial congregation, it's like more is put on you. And everybody has to participate in that to lay down their own self-will and all, and to love one another. But yeah, it's not inherent. It doesn't just happen. It's really on purpose.
So I'm going to pick on Neil a little bit because I know about his church somewhat, and transition us to everybody start thinking, okay, and Megan, you can pick one of the last two slides, either hopes or implications. What are the implications for your ministry? And the question that I have, I'm actually going to direct to Neil because I've come to your congregation several times, and I feel that if the definition of diversity is something around people are able to be themselves and to bring who they actually are, I experience that more in your congregation than any congregation I've ever visited, actually. And so, can you share one or two examples of the more difficult kind of diversity that goes beyond just how it looks, but it's how people are actually free or not free, and what that looks like in your actual context.
Coming from the outside, I think this is great, but I see it from the inside. And so I see all the problems, this person hates this person. So there's a lot of mess that goes on, and yet somehow God makes that mess so, makes it okay. But one of the things that model, we were talking about worship leaders, having different, if you're in a diverse church, have different people in ministry and preaching, up front, because it models something. Even though, like in our church, sometimes to have someone come up and share or sing or something like that might not be, very good, and yet the modeling of it, and they're doing it for the Lord, is a great thing. And so to me, I always been that way, of saying it doesn't have to be excellent. If we were a Willow Creek church trying to get everything excellent, this is going to appeal to people, you eliminate 90% of the people if they don't do something. And so that's one issue I always have to balance, is that for the sake of modeling diversity, be willing to give on how excellent stuff is.
So does that relate to things that you found, Neil's example, or is that different?
Well, I think it is important to give people space in order to lead, for example. One of the things was found is that having multiracial leadership, to have people of different races really on all levels of leadership is really important. And in your specific case, you're talking about excellence, but I think we can draw upon that to say, different cultures have different understandings of what excellence looks like and how things should be done. So it might be a little different than whether someone can actually sing or not, but can they sing with the in the style that someone prefers?
Or is it acceptable to sing and not hit all the notes? Is that excellent worship versus excellent singing? Right, or the way that some right, sure, maybe maybe the mother of someone who's singing is just like, wow, that's the most beautiful thing I've heard, but to the Lord it's a joyful noise, but to some of us it isn't always. But it's the way that a meeting is being facilitated, is the way that an event is being coordinated, is the way that someone is being counseled up to someone's standards or not. And our standards, though there are shared elements there, it is also culturally informed. And so someone might be doing something of another race or culture and being like, man, I would not do it that way. But for people from that culture, that might be like, wow, someone's finally speaking my language. I can get into that. So other contexts that you guys are working in, either to share or ask questions?
The church I go to is, I think, more and more diverse with an ever-growing population of recent immigrants, just from all over the world. And I've been wondering about how egalitarian our church is in terms of reflecting all the immigrants. And I wonder if there valuation you recommend, or assessment measure, or how do churches internally regulate or reflect on their egalitarianness?
So you mean to assess it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. The question is there valuations determine how egalitarian a congregation is? And this is leaning more into the questions of what tools are there to move more towards a successfully integrated multiracial congregation. And this is something my thesis focuses on less. I start with really understanding the problem in depth, so then I can go and find solutions. So I don't know of a tool for that in particular. What I can refer you to, though, is I have sort of descriptions and charts of churches that are at different points in the journey of becoming a more egalitarian community, and then also some studies that look at the process of becoming more egalitarian and what changes need to take place. I would think that there would be a tool that does help to evaluate. I'm just not sure what that is right now. But if you're curious, I could probably direct you in the right direction, or even go ahead and try to find something for you.
Was the author who sort of coined that egalitarian multiracial community term?
The definition that I'm using is Michael Emerson. He's really the leading expert on this in particular. However, he's not the one who did the research on becoming more egalitarian. I can refer you to some other resources, maybe afterwards.
And that's a good use of your card too, for Megan, things you'd like to learn more about. Sarah?
Well, I guess I just was going to say that Greg Detweiler might have a resource on that.
Good point.
I seem to remember him talking about that at some point, so he might have some other tools that he's heard of or connected to.
Great, thank you. She's just saying that Greg might have that resource. Yeah, Rudy.
I just, I think it's important to think about the history of the individual church and also the historical context and so forth. So if you're studying a church in a neighborhood that is racially changing, and the neighborhood used to be white and it's become more black, that church may go through a process of change over time, which you have leaders who are of the church who are white, and then it gradually becomes more of a mixed congregation. So that history might be kind of characterized a little bit more in the 60s and 70s and so forth, and congregations all over the country have experienced that transition. And at some points, the church might be multiracial, but it's in the process of changing from maybe all white to all black or something. And then there are other kinds of histories of a church where it might be, a congregation that is gradually seeing more immigrants come to the church. So there might be 3 or 4 different groups that are gradually growing in the diversity, like maybe Hispanic and Asian and another group. So it's not just 2 groups, but it's just general several different groups. So I think each church and its history and its historical context is kind of important.
Yeah, Rudy was just pointing out that how a church becomes multiracial makes a difference. Is it a change in the larger community? Maybe a church is multiracial, not with the vision and intention to stay that way, but just as part of a community transformation, moving from one race to the other race. And that's very much true. How a church becomes multiracial does make a difference and impacts the dynamics. Michael Emerson actually found a variety of ways that churches become multiracial. It might be because of community change. It might be, to answer more of the second part of your question, it might be because they have a renewed interest in reaching out to the community. It might be because there's 2 different churches merging. Maybe a denomination, there's 2 small congregations and they're requiring them to merge. Another reason, it might even be for financial reasons that motivates them, saying, we don't have enough people, but we need to go out to the community, and this is not necessarily because of a vision for community outreach or to accommodate the community, but because we need to bring in whoever walks past our doors. And all of those motivations are going to interact with other dynamics to be able to shape the character of the congregation. And if you guys are more interested in that, there's actually other reasons, a whole table that I can show you as well.
So Megan and gang, in terms of applying this to our work setting here at UTC, if you could, participants, try and think of questions that really help with that. And I have one too.
This is not a question, but I want to throw it on the table. So EGC is not a church, but in many ways, a lot of the same variables and factors that go into church happen here. And so I think technically, we definitely historically have been, and I believe by the definition technically now are multiracial and still majority white. And so, and there has been talk about worship style and prayer style, and also something that has not been talked about in the study, in the studies you're highlighting, the communication style, and that there being certain culture here and it being really difficult to move against that grain. And so I think as we continue this conversation or the conversation continues at other points in times, discovering, like, is it egalitarian, and if not, what do you do, is not just implications for the churches we work with, but there's implications for how we do business here in the building.
Absolutely. Stacy was just saying that this not only applies to multiracial congregations, but also to multiracial organizations, such as EGC, where she believes we are technically multiracial by definition, but still predominantly white. And so we need to start asking ourselves, if I'm summarizing correctly, if something is done this way, then is that egalitarian? Is that creating a space for different people to be themselves and to make contributions, or is it not?
So can I put like a sub-point under where Stacy was headed, connected to your presentation? You talked about stages versus interaction. And so you said something like having diversity, either visually or even in terms of things being done on stage, does not translate to congregants sort of interacting with each other in egalitarian ways. So again, for the purposes of this conversation, we're holding egalitarian up as the goal and suspending our disbelief about that, which may or may not be the case in our different settings, but that's what we're trying to learn from. And what would you, and this is a kind of tough question, so anybody can answer it, but what would you say is the parallel in a ministry work setting that's not a church like UTC to the stage, where we might make changes on the stage, so to speak, and what would be the parallel to the kinds of interaction that show and reflect actual egalitarian diversity and self-expression?
It's a great question. I can dive right into it if you want me to answer it first, or if you want to give other people space.
Why don't you give us a hint on how it might go?
Sure. Having just been posed with a question, I would say it would have to do with leadership here at EGC, both who is in official administrative positions, but also who you see at the front of a room in any given context, and also beyond that, when people are at the front of the room, how much influence do they have in the way that they are doing things? So are they conforming to an established structure that might have been birthed out of a very particular culture or even a time period? Or are they able to shape those systems and the ways of doing things to accommodate something that reflects their cultural preferences, but also that they feel can be life-giving to other people in the organization?
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I would tap on to that about the specific about leadership is also in talking to leaders, even leaders of color, the question still needs to be asked though, are you having to talk a certain way or live on a certain path in order to be accepted? So just because someone's in leadership or just because someone's in the front of the room, it can't be assumed that it is egalitarian or that they're able to be fully themselves, because a lot of people in leadership learn how to assimilate to the culture, right? And are you punished for being divergent against that? Do we celebrate when there's moments of disruption within the culture, or do we try to like, oh, that's not how we do it because it's not polite, or using other superlatives, but that could be code when you dig a little deeper for white.
That's kind of like what Dorothy was saying. How do you get underneath the defenses to see how people really feel? You know, how do they feel at church? Do they feel accepted? Do they feel kind of a little bit lower? Do they feel like I'm trying to perform like somebody else? You know, how do you get underneath of that? So we find out.
Yeah.
And I just was thinking of the historical norms and traditions that can be so just sort of, we all sort of start to say, oh, that's how it's done, like here at EGC, but like maybe there are, spaces to rethink that, or yeah, I like how you said that, Stacy, of like when there is a different voice, like that disruption might be hard to hear, or it might not be done in the way we like think we can receive give the best or whatever, but it's still important to listen and to like say, okay, what's going on under this and why, and how are people feeling. But yeah, I mean, I definitely, I've recognized that it's really easy for the leadership to attract other people that are like them, you know, like, and so for me, like white women that are around my age, like, just seem to always be like the easiest kind of group to be connecting to. So like
Sure.
to try to press in and connect out and be putting myself in other contexts. One other quick thing is with EGC, I think I've talked about this with others before too, but just the culture around nonprofit ministry, fundraising, your salary, missionary, you know, that's a particular sort of almost privileged place to be working, and a lot of people. Anyway, so that gets into the economic differences and diversity as well, and cultural expectations.
Who can afford to take that risk?
Yeah. Yeah.
See, in church, you don't have that much. People just tell you, you know, because it's not like they're working there. So people might be a little bit more honest. Probably by their feet.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
Because if people don't like it, they go somewhere else.
Yeah.
although over time that happens in the workplace too.
Yeah.
So when I worked at EGC 3 times in 3 different decades. And in the first decade, there were a lot more African American men here, for example. But there were no Asians at all. And so I think I actually was praying for Asians back then. I joke with God that my prayer was too specific because we had Asians, but then we lost a lot of the diversity that we had in other areas. And some people have pointed out, not just racially, but like extrovert, introvert, and sort of dominant alpha personalities, and different kinds of people that don't end up feeling comfortable bucking the system aren't here as much as they used to be. And so I think this has implications outside of racial egalitarianism into all other kinds of things that might be racially tied or culturally tied. And people do vote with their feet over time in the workplace as well. It just takes a little bit longer to find somewhere to go when you have to find a paying job.
I was thinking that, I was thinking of people in our church, but we shouldn't assume that everyone who's Black necessarily comes from a strong Black church tradition. They might have come from a more secular Black tradition, but they don't really have any particular religious tradition that shaped their identity that much. And so, when they come in, that might be a different situation than somebody who grew up in a very traditional Black church. And even the Black church is in the process of change as well, not just one particular tradition. I mean, there are certain probably dominant traditions, but like Calvary Baptist Church has a very different religious tradition probably, or style than, say, Jubilee, which is, it's probably quite a different feel. So I'm just saying, depending on the person's background, the individual's background who's coming into our church, the thing that they might find that's most important is not necessarily the worship style, but it's that, do I feel a part of the family? And almost everyone who has given the testimony says, I just felt accepted and I felt like I was a part of the family. So I think that sense of community and family can be one of the really important things.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rudy. Rudy was just talking about how, when Blacks come to a multiracial congregation, it depends on the type of worship tradition, denomination they might have been a part of previously, and actually whether or not they were part of a Christian community or coming from the secular world. It's going to shape how they interact. And to tie it to ministry even here at EGC, I would say that people of different races, they have different levels of, or sort of like different degrees of culture identity, how much their culture really shapes their identity, how much they conform to, say, the stereotype of what we think a person of that race would be like, and how much they're different from those things. And so you can have someone with a really strong Black identity and someone with, a not as strong Black identity, and how those people interact in a community is going to be different. And I think it's important for us to recognize, okay, who are the whites or the people of color in this community, and where do they really fall on these spectrums, and how is that impacting our community? Are we open to people who are only willing to conform more to, say, a white overarching culture, or if someone has a really strong Black identity or some other racial identity, then is it a space that's welcome for them as well?
Well, we've come close to the end of our time. Thank you, Megan. So thank you again for your opportunity.
You're welcome.
And Megan wanted to finish with a special presentation.
Yes. As I mentioned, when I was here working on this thesis, I was a research fellow under Nika and Rudy's leadership. And Rudy, if I can ask you to come here, I would like to present you with a copy of my thesis. And this is actually to be put in the EGC library, so anyone can access it. But because Rudy worked with me most directly on my thesis, because he read over many, many chapters, there's 345 pages here. So Rudy did a lot of reading and a lot of editing and drew upon his incredible knowledge of the greater Boston community and the church in general to guide me and correct me and encourage me along the way. So I'd like to present this to you, Rudy, and thank you very, very much for your help.
Thank you, Rudy. Thank you, Megan. And thank you, all of you, for being part of today.